I want us to look at Romans 12, 1 to 8, and we're going to focus on two imaginary people. We're going to have a look at Fred and Daniel. Sorry? This is the sermon. It's in two bits, but yes. Now Fred comes from a long line of Freds. In fact, his ancestry goes back to the times of the early church. This particular Fred had gone to Rome on a break. He likes breaks. It was good to get away from the busyness of the things that he was doing. He seemed to keep very busy. You see, being a fully equipped disciple meant that he had so many opportunities to do things for God. So many, in fact, that he hardly had any time to spare. In fact, he was beginning to wonder if perhaps he was a little bit too busy and becoming less reliable. He tended to miss out on his times alone with God. He knew them to be important, but somehow they just got overtaken by events. But recently he'd been challenged. It wasn't as important as what you did for God, it was why you did it that mattered. You did it for God. You did it because of who God is. Your love for him. After all, God had done so much for Fred and for us. So Fred decided to get away on a sort of retreat. He wasn't good at just sitting around in the countryside or on the beach, which is where retreat places tended to be. So he decided to go to the big city. There'd be lots to do in Rome, so he wouldn't be idle. Perhaps he'd missed the point of a retreat, but he thought, well, change is as good as a rest. It was all very well, but he miscalculated when he arrived there because there were lots of Christians getting ready for the great festival of Easter. He knew that Easter meant so much and joined in, so being true to his general attitude. The crowd, there really was a crowd, were holding a procession to recreate the time that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey on his way to the cross. Imagine Fred's surprise when, in the melee of the crowd, he bumped into somebody he remembered from a long time ago. So I've introduced Fred as the fully resourced and equipped disciple. Meet Daniel. Daniel is the divinely appointed, non-involved, evangelical, laid-back Christian. So it was Daniel. He'd moved to Rome and Fred had lost touch with him. There weren't any electronics in his days, and to be honest, although he knew Daniel to be a Christian, he'd not rated Daniel's example too highly. He saw him as a very mediocre Christian. Divinely appointed, non-involved, evangelical, laid-back Christian. Well, that summed Daniel up to a T. Fred and Daniel got talking. Daniel said that there was some exciting news in the church. A letter had arrived from Paul. Well, Fred hadn't met Paul, but he had a great reputation as an apostle. And Paul used to persecute the Christians, but had changed when he became a Christian himself. He was now respected by lots of Christians and had started several churches. Paul had written several helpful letters, even though they were a bit critical at times. The letter to the Romans was long. In fact, the church had decided to read it in two bits. The first part was all about the fundamentals of the Christian faith, and it was very thorough. The procession was heading to a large forum where the second part of the letter would be read. Fred and Paul went along with the crowd. Fred and Daniel went along with the crowd. The leader of the church was about to start. Daniel listened, and so did Fred. Everyone listened. You could have heard a pin drop. Fred realised that, although he thought he was fully equipped, he still had things to learn. And something in him told him that this was the time. Who knows? God might even have planned for the divinely appointed, not involved, evangelical, laid-back Christian to be there for him. Or maybe Fred would be able to help Daniel to become more involved or less lazy in God's service. Maybe they needed each other. The second part of the letter was all about applying the teaching to everyday life. It made a lot of sense, but some of it was quite challenging. In other words, it was fairly easy to understand, but hard to put into practice. The reader came to these words: "Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, for this is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." What, Fred wondered, did that bit about presenting your body as a living sacrifice mean? They were used to the gladiators, where lives were often sacrificed, but that was by force. They also knew of the animal sacrifices that the priests made for the Jews. But Paul couldn't have been talking about either of those. They seemed so final. What it seemed to mean was that people should offer God everything in order to serve him. That, after all, was what Jesus had done. So Fred, our fully resourced and equipped disciple, thought he'd done that. After all, he was very busy all the time. That was why he was on his break. But he was a bit taken aback when the letter talked about this being an act of spiritual worship. You see, Fred didn't often worship, well, except on Sundays, not with him being so busy. Even then, he missed a few when there was something else to do. Daniel, on the other hand, had a different problem. He thought that he was holy, but he was struck by the dedication that would be required to offer himself as a sacrifice. After all, that would mean giving up time to worship and serve God. And he wasn't used to doing that. He'd do it when he felt like it, but making it a priority? That would be a bit limiting in the long term, surely. All the other things he was used to doing, perhaps giving them up for the unknown. Wonder, are you a Fred or a Daniel? Has God spoken something into you that has just resonated? Have you heard God's voice?
Have you heard God's voice? Has your heart been stirred? Are you still prepared to follow? Have you made a choice to remain and serve? Though the way be rough and narrow, will you walk the path that will cost you much and embrace the pain and sorrow? Will you trust in one who entrusts to you the disciples of tomorrow? Will you use your voice? Will you not sit down when the multitudes are silent? Will you make a choice to stand your ground when the crowds are turning violent? Will you walk the path that will cost you much and embrace the pain and sorrow? Will you trust in one who entrusts to you the disciples of tomorrow? In your city streets, will you be God's heart? Will you listen to the voiceless? Will you stop and eat? And when friendships start, Will you share your faith with faithless? Will you walk the path that will cost you much and embrace the pain and sorrow? Will you trust in one who entrusts to you the disciples of tomorrow? Will you watch the news with the eyes of faith and believe it could be different? Will you share your views using words of grace? Will you leave a thoughtful imprint? We will walk the path that will cost us much and embrace the pain and sorrow. And we will trust in one who entrusts to us the disciples of tomorrow.
To be honest, they found this a bit tough, a bit challenging. They both have to think again. The bit about having your minds transformed was interesting. That would mean big changes. Would mean a new outlook. It was Fred who picked it up first. He was worried about this step into the unknown. He remembered a story about a couple of caterpillars, Spotty and Tufty. Spotty and Tufty were on the same leaf, crawling along. Tufty noticed that Spotty looked a bit sad, and my two helpful friends, Spotty and Tufty, will take over. Tufty first.
What's wrong, Spotty? Are you feeling bad?
Oh yes, I am so worried about our next life. I can feel that it's about time for me to spin my cocoon. I just know that I'm going to hate it.
But why do you think you're going to hate it?
I've heard other caterpillars talking, and they told me that the next life will not get to eat any more green leaves.
Oh no.
Not all. We will be forced to walk on only 6 legs, and we will not be green anymore.
Thank you. With that, the two little caterpillars went on their way, dreading the day when they'd be forced to become butterflies. Now, we smile, we giggle, and we know how much better off the caterpillars are going to be. Not eating green leaves, but enjoying the colourful flowers. Not walking around on the trees, but flying gracefully through the air. The colours will be the colours of the rainbow. Yet they couldn't know what lay ahead. Daniel realised that this was true for him. God had provided a way for every need a person has in the life to be met. While we don't know what lies ahead in our eternity, God will provide for us. His way would be perfect and acceptable, but Fred and Daniel would have to let go of their own agendas and their own ways of thinking. The next bit touched a bit of a sore point with Fred. For by grace you have given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the measure of faith God has given you. Well, Fred, you see, he realised that not only was he always busy, but he'd become proud of the way people admired him for what he did. The letter said that he should be humble as he served, not think of himself more highly than he should. After all, it was God who he was serving. And God was so magnificent and treated everyone so well. Fred realised that he thought more of who God was. Fred realised that if he thought more of who God was, He couldn't help but see of himself more humbly. He remembered from the scriptures that if humbled himself and sought God, then amazing things would happen. So Fred resolved to do something about that today. God had given him so much. Paul wrote about it as being a grace given to him. And the least that Fred could do was to look at the amount of faith he had. Humbly accept God's grace, like Paul, and put himself right before God. Being reliant upon God was the best thing that he could do. How could he be fully reliable if he wasn't firstly reliant upon God? And as the next bit was read, Fred could see that Daniel looked really uncomfortable. He'd been challenged by the early part and was feeling really uneasy. The next bit made him really think. Just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we who are many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. Well, the letter talked about being part of Christ's body and having a function within it. Now, he knew that this was to do with being an active part of the local church. After all, he enjoyed going when he felt like it and always seemed to be welcome. But the letter seemed to be saying he should make more of a commitment to the other people in the church. To be members of one another, like the writer said, meant making a commitment to each other. Well, Daniel wasn't too hot on that sort of thing. It was the middle part of his name, not involved. He decided that he would really join up with the local church and play a full part in it. The snag was in understanding how he could be involved. He didn't know what he could do, and in all honesty, he hadn't really tried. But the next part of the letter was quite helpful. We all have different gifts according to the grace given to us. If a man's gift is prophesying, let him use it in proportion to his faith. If it is serving, let him serve. If it's teaching, let him teach. If it's encouraging, let him encourage. If it is contributing to the needs of others, let him give generously. If it's leadership, let him govern diligently. If it is showing mercy, let him do it cheerfully. When Paul wrote that we have gifts, he was talking about the special gifts that come from God. Surely, even though Daniel hadn't really been very close to God, he would have some gifts too. His gifts might not be the same as others. In fact, he may only have one. It all depended on God's grace. But surely, everyone had something by way of a gift. Paul had written about several gifts: prophecy, serving others, teaching, contributing to the needs of others, leadership and growing. And Daniel suddenly remembered that he'd heard somewhere that Paul had written to the church in Corinth about gifts as well. So, it must be important then. Daniel wanted to find out about these gifts, and Fred seemed to be able to do some of the things mentioned really well. For example, Fred was really good at showing mercy to others. He was always cheerful. Surely that was a good sign of a gift from God. Daniel asked Fred to help him find out what his gift was. Maybe others in the church could help too, especially if he was going to be a full member of it. While all this was going on in Daniel's mind, Fred was thinking too. He was so used to being busy that he'd failed to realise that the different members of the church had been given these gifts too. If he did everything, there wouldn't be so much opportunity for others to use their gifts. Not only that, but maybe Fred was trying to do things that God had not given him the gift for anyway. Perhaps God was prompting him to think about the sort of ministry that he should focus on, rather than do everything. Well, the letter went on even further, but Fred looked at Daniel and Daniel looked at Fred, and they decided they'd heard enough to be getting on with. So they slipped out to put into action what they'd heard. The first thing was to pray about it. They knew that prayer was important. They had to be humble before God and turn from their wrong ways. Fred needed humility to know that God had given him these gifts. God had called him to do some things really well. He prayed for a right relationship with God and a sense of what God wanted him to do. Fred knew that he needed to have his gifting re-energized so that it would be effective for God in the ways that God wanted him to be. Daniel, on the other hand, knew that he was divinely appointed, but he needed humility to ask for forgiveness for being a non-involved, evangelical, lazy-back Christian. He wanted to find out the gifts that God had for him. He made a commitment to God that he would play a full part in his local church and use the gifts that God had given him. So I wonder, are you a Fred, a Daniel, or maybe somewhere in between? Well, I hope that you've been inspired to think about your Christian life as a disciple of Jesus. God doesn't want us to stand still. It's his business of transforming lives. He's all powerful and could just zap us all with the gifts and enthusiasm we need, transforming our lives in the process. But God, as I've heard more than once, is a gentleman. He looks for us to look to him and surrender our own agendas, maybe even our own lives. As part of his plan, he's brought us to this church, a part of the wider body of Christ. And it's great to have people from Malaysia and India and Feltham and even Ashford with us online as well as part of this church, the wider body of Christ. As we read the scriptures, he provides the church with all the spiritual resources it needs so that we can carry out his work. Some of these resources come as what we call gifts of the Spirit, which are given to all Christians as the Spirit sees they are needed. I'm back again in 2 weeks' time, and Fred and Daniel are coming with me. We'll see how they're getting on. But in the meantime, may I encourage you to think about your relationship with Jesus. That's fundamental. How is it between you and Jesus? Jesus calls on us to surrender our own futures to him. Have you done that? Will you do that? Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you found that sermon helpful and would like to join us again on another Sunday. In the meantime, you'll find resources available at our website, on YouTube, so please do take the opportunity to have a look. But let's hope to see you soon. God bless you.